She found 2 crying babies in the snow. 4 years later, their real father, a billionaire CEO, came knocking on her door. Snow had swallowed the little town of Willow Ridge whole that night. The streets were empty, lights blurred behind veils of white, and the wind carried a soft, endless cry through the alleyways. Inside Thread and Mercy, a small tailor shop glowing with golden lamplight, Harper Vale brushed the last bits of thread from the floor. Her hands were rough from years of stitching, her eyes tired but gentle. She was 24, living alone above the shop, surviving on commissions that barely kept the lights on. Just as she reached for the final lamp, a sound cut through the storm, faint, broken, and desperate. A baby's cry. Then another. Harper froze. The scissors in her hand clattered to the floor. She stepped toward the back door, heart pounding in her throat. When she opened it, the cold hit her like a wall. Snowflakes spun wildly in the alley's dim light. Then she saw it. A small basket near the firewood stack, lined with deep purple velvet. Inside were 2 newborn girls, red-faced and trembling, wrapped in woolen blankets. Harper dropped to her knees, her breath fogging the air. Each baby wore a silver pendant, identical, a tiny falling leaf carved with impossible precision. Beneath them, tucked into the blanket, was a torn photograph, half of a smiling woman's face. No note, no name, just the sound of crying. She should have called someone, the police, social services, anyone. But she didn't move. One of the babies whimpered, reaching out blindly, and her tiny fingers brushed Harper's thumb, gripping, holding, refusing to let go. That single touch cut through every rule, every logic, every boundary. Harper lifted both babies against her chest, their warmth seeping into her frozen skin. The world outside vanished, the snow, the silence, the loneliness. Only their fragile heartbeats remained. She whispered into the storm, voice trembling, "From now on, I'll be the thread that keeps you together." And with that promise, she stepped back inside, closing the door softly behind her as the snow continued to fall. Weeks turned into months of paperwork and sleepless nights. No one came forward, no missing child alerts, no family. The case went cold. Harper was officially granted guardianship of the 2 abandoned girls. She named them Aria and Lila. Aria, older by minutes, was quiet and dreamy, always humming, always holding a crayon, leaving colorful marks on receipts and fabric scraps. Lila was her opposite, bold, curious, constantly asking questions that Harper didn't have answers for. She once tried to sew her own sock at age 2, stabbing her thumb in the process and crying only until Harper kissed it better. Their tiny apartment above the shop became a kingdom of giggles and spilled cereal. Mornings were chaos, nights were lullabies and needlework. Harper sewed each dress by hand, soft cotton with tiny embroidered stars. She kept every outgrown one folded neatly in a wooden chest, like a diary written in fabric. Life was simple, small, and breathtakingly full. The shop barely survived, but love bloomed in its cracks. Harper learned the sound of Lila's laughter, the shade of Aria's favorite color, the way they both liked apples peeled but not too skinny. She memorized their breathing at night and their warmth when they fell asleep tangled beside her sewing table. Still, some nights, when the girls were asleep and the shop lay in silence, she would take out the old photograph and 2 tiny pendants from a tin box under her bed. The falling leaf still shimmered faintly under the lamp. The torn photo still held that unknown woman's smile, half a face, half a story. She told herself it didn't matter. That family wasn't about blood, but about who stayed. But one afternoon, as Aria colored on the floor and Lila tried to help fold fabric, Aria looked up and asked softly, "Mommy, where's our daddy?" The question hit Harper like a needle through the heart. She froze, trying to steady her voice. "I don't know, sweetheart," she whispered, kneeling beside her. "But you have me. You'll always have me." Aria nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. 4 years passed. One snowy evening, Harper received a letter, an invitation to the Winter Hope Gala, a charity event for foster children. They needed a local tailor for last-minute suit fittings, and someone had recommended her. It was an opportunity she couldn't refuse. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and white tablecloths. Harper arrived with the twins, each wearing handmade pink dresses with tulle skirts and embroidered hems. They clutched Ziploc bags of heart-shaped cookies she'd baked that morning, giggling as they offered them to tuxedoed strangers. And that's when Matthew Ashbourne saw them. From across the room, the 36-year-old CEO of Ashbourne Biotech, a man known for his sharp intellect and silent grief, stopped mid-conversation. His gaze locked on the two girls in pink, blonde curls, silver leaf pendants, eyes that looked far too familiar. His chest tightened. He knew those necklaces. He had designed them himself, one for each of his twin daughters, Arabella and Leona, who died in the fire 4 years ago. Or so he'd been told. Matthew's glass slipped from his hand. He barely heard it shatter. His heart roared in his ears as he crossed the room, unable to breathe, unable to think. He stopped in front of the girls. Lila looked up first, bold as ever. "Hi," she said. "You look like my bedtime pillow." He blinked. "Your pillow?" "Uh-huh," she said matter-of-factly. "It smells like you." Matthew's world tilted. His knees went weak. He bent down and tied her undone shoelace with shaking fingers just to keep from falling apart. Harper turned, startled to see a stranger kneeling before her daughters. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, stepping forward. "Are they bothering you?" Matthew stood, his voice barely steady. "No, not at all. They're beautiful. Are they yours?" "Yes," Harper replied, smiling faintly. "They're my daughters." "Twins?" "Yes." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "They remind me of someone I used to know." The words hung heavy between them. Harper gently called the girls back. They skipped to her side, giggling. The necklaces glimmered under the chandelier, and Matthew's breath caught. Because in that moment, he knew. They weren't strangers. They were his daughters. Matthew Ashbourne didn't sleep that night. The image of those two little girls haunted him. Their eyes, their laughter, their silver necklaces glinting beneath the ballroom light. He sat in his penthouse apartment, a city of glass and silence stretching beneath him, replaying the moment over and over. It was impossible. His daughters had been gone for 4 years, lost in the fire that destroyed his estate and shattered his world. He had buried 2 empty coffins. He had seen the flames with his own eyes. And yet, deep in his chest, something ancient and undeniable whispered, "They're alive." By dawn, Matthew had scoured the internet, searching through every photo from the Winter Hope Gala. Finally, in a wide shot of the crowd, his heart stopped. There, barely visible, was a small sign outside a shop window behind the group of guests. The words read, "Thread and Mercy, Harper Vale, Taylor." 2 hours later, Matthew was behind the wheel, snow slashing against the windshield as he drove north through the Oregon countryside. His mind was a storm of disbelief and fragile hope. When he arrived in Willow Ridge, the town looked untouched by time. Children's drawings taped to bakery windows, icicles hanging from lampposts, the faint smell of pine and cinnamon in the cold air. And there it was, her shop. Modest, quaint, with ivy crawling up one side and lace curtains softening the glow from within. Harper was inside, sweeping the floor while Arya and Lila played with scraps of fabric on the carpet. She didn't hear him approach until the bell above the door chimed softly. She looked up and froze. Matthew stood there, tall in a dark overcoat, holding his hat awkwardly in one hand. The exhaustion in his face was softened only by the strange tenderness in his eyes. "Mr. Ashbourne?" Harper's voice faltered. "You... from the gala?" He nodded gently. "I'm sorry for dropping by unannounced. I need a suit tailored for a conference." "You were the first person who came to mind." Harper hesitated, torn between suspicion and politeness. Finally, she stepped aside. "Come in." The shop was warm and smelled faintly of cedar and thread wax. Sketches lined the wall. A child's crayon drawing of a princess hung beside them. Matthew's eyes swept the room, then found the twins sitting cross-legged on the rug. Lila was coloring a purple blob with legs. She looked up proudly. "This is you," she said. "In Mommy's wedding dress." Harper gasped. "Lila!" But Matthew chuckled softly, the sound cracking through the heaviness in his chest. "If wearing that means I get 2 princesses like you, I'll take it." Harper knelt beside him to take his measurements. Her fingers brushed his sleeve. Professional, but something electric passed between them. She noticed the way his gaze lingered on the girls, the way his expression softened every time Lila giggled or Arya hummed. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. When Lila yawned, she climbed into Matthew's lap as if she had always known him. He froze for a second, then carefully held her, afraid any sudden movement would break the spell. The warmth of her small body against his chest unraveled 4 years of grief. His arms wrapped around her instinctively. His throat ached, and his eyes burned, but he didn't let go. Later that night, after he had gone, Harper couldn't shake the unease curling through her chest. She went upstairs after the girls had fallen asleep and unlocked the drawer where she kept the torn photograph. For the first time, she looked closer. Her breath caught. The half-smiling man beside the woman in the photo. It was him. Matthew Ashbourne. She turned on her laptop, hands trembling, and searched. Ashbourne family fire twins. News headlines flooded the screen. Biotech mogul mourns wife and twin daughters after tragic estate fire. Private security suspected of negligence in Ashbourne blaze. Every article carried the same date, the same night, the same story. And yet, the babies had been found hours later, abandoned, alive, left in a basket lined with purple velvet. Harper's heart raced. "If he's their father," she whispered, "why were they left alone?" For a few days, she tried to ignore the gnawing sense of danger, but strange things began to happen. First came the muddy footprints outside her porch, large, deep, appearing overnight and vanishing just as suddenly. Then the feeling of being watched when she walked home from the grocery store. Heavy footsteps behind her, always just out of sight. She told herself it was paranoia. Until one stormy night, when the sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet. Harper ran to the front room, heart hammering. The display window had been smashed, shards scattered across the floor, a brick lying amid torn fabric. Rain lashed through the hole, soaking the curtains. She rushed outside clutching a pair of sewing shears, but whoever had done it was gone. Then she saw the words sprayed in red across the wall. "Don't dig up the past." Her breath caught in her throat. She ran upstairs to the girls' room. They were crying, huddled together in bed. She gathered them in her arms, whispering, "It's okay. I've got you. You're safe." But her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The next morning, the bell above the shop door rang sharply. Matthew stormed in, his face pale, eyes blazing. "I read about the break-in," he said. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Harper muttered, sweeping glass into a pile. "You're bleeding," he said quietly. She glanced down. Her palm was sliced, blood soaking through a paper towel. Without a word, Matthew knelt and wrapped his handkerchief around her hand, his movements slow, deliberate, trembling. "You need security," he said. "I can't afford—" "I can." His tone left no room for argument. That night, a black SUV parked across the street. 2 discreet guards took shifts outside. The twins waved at them from the window, giggling, thinking it was a game. Matthew stayed too. He slept in his car outside the shop, one eye open, heart wide awake. And inside that tiny world of thread and chaos, something changed. He became part of their rhythm, morning pancakes shaped like bears, Lila's insistence that he braid her hair. "Even if it looks bad, Daddy. I mean, mister." Arya humming softly, while Matthew fixed a crooked chair leg with the same focus he once used in laboratories. Harper watched it all from across the room, her chest tightening. There was no pretending in the way he looked at them. No pretending in the way he tucked a strand of hair behind Lila's ear, or how he smiled when Arya showed him a crayon drawing. It was the look of a man who had lost the world and found it again in 2 small bodies. That night, When the twins were asleep, Harper poured 2 cups of chamomile tea and sat across from him at the sewing table. The hum of the machine had died down, and the only light came from the lamp's golden glow. "No more lies," she said quietly. "Who are you to them?" Matthew didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. Their mother, Isla, died 2 months after giving birth. The fire happened soon after. I was told there were no survivors. He paused, staring into his cup as if it could show him mercy. "I buried 2 empty coffins," he said, "because there wasn't enough left to find." Harper swallowed hard. "I think someone wanted you to believe that." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the photograph. The same torn image that had haunted her for years. She slid it across the table. Matthew stared at it for a long time. His own face, Isla's smile, her pregnant belly, and written faintly on the back, in faded ink, "For the one who finds them." His throat tightened. Harper whispered, "I think they were meant to find you again. But maybe they were meant to find me, too." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was sacred. The truth had finally found air, and it was heavy enough to make them both tremble. Outside, the snow began to fall again, quiet and endless, as if the world was holding its breath. The DNA tests came back, and the truth was undeniable. Aria and Lila were Matthew Ashbourne's daughters. The world that had collapsed around him 4 years ago was slowly piecing itself back together, but in its place stood something new, fragile, fierce, and trembling with purpose. Matthew couldn't rest. The joy of finding his daughters had awakened an older ache, the question of how they'd survived when the fire had consumed everything else. He dug into his company's archives, private records, security reports, and a name began to surface again and again: Vincent Marlowe. Once his right-hand man, Vincent had been ambitious, brilliant, and ruthlessly charming, but he had also been greedy. Matthew had fired him after discovering he'd been leaking confidential research to a rival corporation. A week later, the fire took everything. Back then, Matthew had been too broken to see patterns. But now, with Harper's steady voice grounding him and the twins' laughter echoing through the shop, his mind sharpened like a blade finding its edge again. Vincent had waited until he was weakest, until grief had hollowed him out. Now Matthew saw it clearly. It wasn't coincidence. It was design. He quietly hired investigators, cross-checking property contractors, security personnel, and shell companies. The deeper he went, the uglier it got. Records showed that the security firm guarding his estate had been subcontracted through a Marlowe-owned LLC. And the man who'd rewired the nursery just weeks before the fire? Same connection. It wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up. Harper watched the storm build behind Matthew's calm exterior. She could see the sleeplessness, the tremor in his hands as he stitched together every terrible truth. She didn't tell him to stop. She simply stood by him, sometimes at the shop counter while he made phone calls, sometimes sitting with him while the twins played nearby, their laughter softening the edges of their pain. Then came a breakthrough. Harper remembered a neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Langley who'd once mentioned installing a video doorbell years ago. "It stopped working after a storm," he'd said. "But I think I backed something up on my old phone." They drove to his house together, explained what they were searching for. The man shuffled through drawers until he found a dusty flip phone with a cracked screen. "Don't know if it still works," he murmured. It didn't. But Matthew wasn't giving up. He took it to a tech repair shop, paid them to recover whatever they could. For 2 days he barely ate, barely spoke. When the footage finally loaded, everyone in the room fell silent. The screen was grainy, but the shapes were clear enough. A man in a dark overcoat, tall, shoulders squared, moving toward the Ashbourne estate gate in the middle of the night. He glanced around, unlocked the gate, and disappeared inside. 10 minutes later, he reemerged, carrying something wrapped in a blanket. 2 small bundles. He looked directly at the camera for a split second before turning away. The face, though blurred, was unmistakable. Vincent Marlowe. The timestamp was 3 days before the fire. Harper felt her stomach twist. Matthew stood frozen, fists clenched, breathing through his teeth. "He took them," he said hoarsely. "He took my daughters and let me believe they were dead." The pain in his voice was raw enough to crack the air. Harper reached for his hand, her voice steady but trembling. "Then take back what he stole. Not with rage, with truth." Matthew nodded slowly. "Justice," he said almost to himself. "For them, for Isla, for you." He wasn't alone anymore, and he knew it. The next morning he called his lawyers. By noon the case was filed: child abduction, arson conspiracy, falsifying death records, and destruction of evidence. The news exploded. Headlines screamed across every network. CEO Matthew Ashbourne's twin daughters found alive after 4 years. Ex-executive Vincent Marlowe named prime suspect in Ashbourne fire. Cameras camped outside the courthouse, desperate for a glimpse of the family that had risen from ashes. But Matthew refused interviews. His focus was singular: protect Harper and the twins. When the first hearing came, Harper didn't sit in the crowd. She sat beside him. Matthew walked into the courtroom with his hand resting lightly on hers, a quiet signal that the woman who had saved his daughters would never stand behind him, only beside. As the trial began, layers of deceit unfolded like rotten fabric. Witnesses spoke of hush payments, erased records, and falsified reports. One former nurse took the stand, Miriam Brooks, her eyes wet with guilt. She confessed that Vincent had come to her the night of the fire, claiming he was taking the babies somewhere safe because the house had been threatened. "He said their father wouldn't cope," she whispered. "He said the girls were in danger." Her voice cracked. "I didn't know he'd leave them to die in the snow. I thought—" She couldn't finish. The courtroom went silent except for the sound of Harper's quiet sob. Matthew didn't look away. He had lived with ghosts long enough. Now he was watching them burn. When the defense tried to shift blame, the prosecution dropped their final piece of evidence: the recovered footage from the neighbor's camera. Gasps rippled through the room. The blurred face turned toward the lens. The faint, crooked smile. Vincent's. It was over. The jury didn't need hours. They needed minutes. Guilty. Vincent Marlowe was led out in handcuffs, face pale and hollow. For a moment, Matthew almost pitied him. Almost. Justice, he realized, didn't roar. It breathed, quietly, steadily. After the verdict, reporters swarmed, but Matthew ignored them. He held Harper's hand and walked straight past the flashing cameras. For once, he wasn't a CEO. He was just a father, reclaiming what had been stolen. That evening, Harper returned to the shop. On her work table sat a wooden box tied with string, no sender, no label, only a note in familiar handwriting: "For the woman who stitched my broken world back together." Inside was an antique sewing machine, her mother's, the one she thought was long gone, restored to gleaming perfection. A brass nameplate was fixed to the front: Ashbourne Atelier, where love mends what fire cannot. Her hands trembled. Tears welled up. When she looked up, Matthew was standing quietly in the doorway, uncertain, vulnerable, waiting. She didn't hesitate. Harper crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. For the first time in years, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt whole. A full year had passed since that winter. The sign above the little tailor shop now read, "Thread and Mercy. Harper, Aria, and Lila." Below it, in delicate script, the words Ashbourne Atelier glimmered faintly in brass, a quiet merge of two worlds that had once been torn apart. The shop had changed, but still smelled of lavender and warm fabric. Saturday mornings were now for laughter and lessons. Harper had started a free sewing class for girls from the local orphanage, teaching small hands how to stitch buttons, mend seams, and maybe, in the process, mend something invisible in themselves. It had become her way of giving back what had once been given to her, a second chance. That morning, sunlight poured through the windows, catching the glitter of pink streamers hung for a celebration. The small garden behind the shop had been transformed into a wonderland. Balloons tied to chairs, a long wooden table covered in strawberry cupcakes, and in the center, a cake shaped like an old sewing machine piped in soft pastel frosting. Today was Arya and Lila's 5th birthday. The twins twirled around the yard in matching blush dresses dotted with embroidered flowers, giggling with frosting on their noses and grass clinging to their bare feet. "Make a wish," Harper called, her voice warm with pride. The guests, local children and volunteers, clapped and cheered as the twins squeezed their eyes shut. 2 candles flickered, 2 wishes were made. As the sun dipped lower, the last guests trickled away. Harper stayed behind to stack plates and fold napkins, humming softly without realizing it. The melody was gentle and familiar, the same lullaby Matthew once hummed to the girls when he thought no one was listening. "Mommy!" a voice called. She turned. Arya and Lila were running across the garden, each holding one of Matthew's hands. He followed behind them, smiling, the kind of smile that only existed when he looked at the 3 of them together. The twins' crowns sat crooked on their heads, their cheeks flushed with happiness. Arya ran forward, clutching a small velvet box. She held it out to Harper. "Here, Mommy," she said proudly. "Daddy said you have to open it now." Harper blinked, confused, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is this?" Lila leaned in, whispering far too loudly. "He said you're the thread that kept him from falling apart." Matthew chuckled softly, kneeling in front of Harper as she opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, with a tiny diamond set in a silver band. But what caught her breath was the engraving inside, stitched by Grace. Matthew's voice was quiet, but steady. "I don't have a speech," he said. "Just this. You held my daughters when the world told you not to. You loved them when no one else would. You loved me without asking for anything back. If you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life stitching every day beside you." For a heartbeat, Harper couldn't breathe. Then she nodded, biting back tears, and the twins squealed, hugging her legs in delight. Matthew stood, slipping the ring onto her finger, as the last of the sunlight turned gold across the garden. He wrapped his arms around her and the girls at once, holding them close, a family, finally whole. That night, after the twins had fallen asleep upstairs, Harper found Matthew sitting on the porch steps, looking out at the stars. He handed her a small envelope. "Something I found in the archives," he said. Inside was a photograph, carefully taped together down the middle. It was the complete version of the torn picture she'd kept for years. Isla Ashbourne smiled softly in it, holding 2 swaddled infants in her arms. Beside her, Matthew stood younger, his eyes filled with a kind of hope he thought had died long ago. Harper traced the image with her thumb. On the back, faint handwriting read, "For the one who finds them, please love them like we do. Isla Ashbourne." Harper's breath caught. She placed the photograph in a silver frame beside her sewing machine, the one Matthew had restored for her. Next to it she set a tiny pair of pink baby shoes, the first thing she'd ever stitched for the girls on that freezing night years ago. As the house grew quiet, Harper stepped onto the porch where Matthew sat waiting. The sky stretched wide above them, full of stars. Arya and Lila's laughter drifted faintly from the open window upstairs. Soft, sleepy, safe. Harper leaned against Matthew's shoulder, his hand finding hers easily, naturally. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. For the first time in years, there was no storm, no fear, no ache left unspoken. Just peace, just love, stitched together by the hands of a woman who had once found 2 babies crying in the snow. And as the night settled around them, Matthew whispered, "You were right, Harper. Family isn't about blood. It's about who stays." She smiled, resting her head against him. "And who sews the pieces back together?" The stars shimmered above Willow Ridge as the world at last exhaled, quiet, whole, and healed.